American Imperialism, the New Manifest Destiny. Lecture terms. Becoming a world power. Focus question. How did the United States emerge as an imperial power in the 1890s? Becoming a world power. America's narrow definition of nationhood was projected abroad in the late 1890s as the United States became an imperial power in the world. The last quarter of the 19th century is known as the Age of Imperialism, when rival European empires divided large parts of the world amongst themselves. In this period, the United States had been considered a second-rate power and was not included in imperial competition and diplomacy that went along with it. Although large land-based empires such as the Russian, the Ottoman, and the Chinese empires, and overseas empires such as the British, the French, and the Spanish, dominated much of the 19th century, after 1870, a, quote, new imperialism emerged. This new imperialism was dominated by European powers and Japan. Belgium, Great Britain, and France consolidated the colonies that they had acquired earlier in Africa, and Germany acquired colonies in Africa at that time as well. The British and the Russians also intensified their struggle to control Central Asia, and all European powers ultimately competed to control parts of China. By the early 20th century, most of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific have been divided among these empires, each of which justified its domination of those peoples in the name of bringing civilization to backward peoples. They believed that these peoples required instruction in Western values, government, Christianity, and labor practices. Territorial expansion had been a part of American life from the beginning, but the 1890s marked a major transformation of America's relationship to the rest of the world. Americans more and more saw their nation as an emerging world power. Until the 1890s, the expansion of the United States had been in North America itself, though ever since the Monroe Doctrine, many Americans had seen the Western Hemisphere as an American sphere of influence. Americans had talked for years of acquiring Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and other territories, but the only territory that was actually acquired after the Civil War was Alaska, and that was regarded by many as worthless frozen tundra. Most who looked overseas wanted to expand trade rather than take new land possessions. Many farmers and manufacturers believed that America's production could no longer be absorbed in domestic markets, and they thought that overproduction was causing recurrent economic crises. They wanted foreign customers for their products. Christian missionaries actively spread American influence overseas in the late 19th century as well. Groups like the Student Volunteer Movement of Foreign Missions believed it was their mission to prepare the world for Christ's second coming and to enlighten the, quote, heathens abroad. A few late 19th century thinkers actively promoted American expansionism. Josiah Strong was a well-known Congregationalist clergyman. He tried to update the idea of manifest destiny in his book, Our Country, published in 1885. He argued in this book that Anglo-Saxon Americans who had shown their ability for liberty and self-government in North America should spread those institutions and values to inferior races, quote, overseas, whom he suggested would benefit American manufacturers ultimately by becoming new customers of American products. The naval officer Alfred T. Mahan, in his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published in 1890, also argued that no nation could prosper without a large merchant fleet engaged in international trade. and they would also need to have a powerful navy to protect the merchant fleet. This would require overseas bases. Mahan insisted that with the western frontier closed, Americans had to look overseas for opportunity. Mahan influenced James G. Blaine, President Benjamin Harrison's Secretary of State, who ultimately advocated the acquisition of Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba for naval bases. In 1893, American planters living in Hawaii organized a rebellion there that overthrew the native Hawaiian government. Though Harrison asked the Senate to pass a treaty of annexation, President Grover Cleveland withdrew it ultimately. In 1898, during the Spanish-American War, the United States annexed Hawaii and the surrounding territories anyways. The Depression that began in 1893 intensified Americans' belief that aggressive foreign policy would create markets for manufactured goods. All these factors contributed to America's emergence as a world power in the Spanish-American War of 1898. But the war's immediate cause had to do with the Cubans' long struggle for national independence from Spain. 10 years of guerrilla warfare began in 1868, and then the revolt resumed once again in 1895. Reports of Cuban civilians suffering in Spanish detention camps aroused outrage and sympathy in America. Cries for intervention increased after February 15, 1898, when an explosion, probably accidental, destroyed the USS Maine, an American battleship that was located in Havana Harbor. This explosion ultimately killed 270 American sailors. And many in America thought that Spain was responsible for this explosion. When Spain rejected American demands for a ceasefire against the Cuban nationals and the eventual Cuban independence, Congress approved President McKinley's request for a declaration of war against Spain. This was justified as a humanitarian intervention on behalf of the Cubans. Congress adopted the Teller Amendment, declaring that the United States had no intention of annexing or dominating Cuba. The war was brief and resulted in only a few hundred American casualties, what one official called a, quote, splendid little war, end quote. The war's most important battle actually happened in the Pacific Ocean, in Manila Bay in the Philippines. This was a Spanish colony, and U.S. Admiral George Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet there. The most publicized land battle of the war involved the assault on San Juan Hill outside Santiago, Cuba. This was done by Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Theodore Roosevelt was a pro-expansionist, and he believed war would unite the nation and its men, whose masculinity, he thought, had suffered in the economic crises of the 1890s. Although Roosevelt organized the Rough Riders to be a cross-section of America, it did exclude blacks, and Roosevelt neglected to mention that black troops had actually reached the top of San Juan Hill long before his troops even got there. But Roosevelt's exploits made him a national hero, and after being elected New York's governor that fall, he ultimately became McKinley's vice president in 1900. An American empire? The war to liberate Cuba soon became an imperial mission that culminated in the creation of a small overseas American empire. McKinley would not return the Philippines to Spain or hand it over to the Filipinos themselves, who had fought for independence, because he didn't believe they could govern themselves. He also spoke of Americans' duty to, quote, uplift and civilize the Filipinos and train them to rule themselves. In the treaty ending the war, the United States acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam from Spain. Before McKinley recognized Cuba's independence, He forced that island's new government to approve the Platt Amendment to the new Cuban Constitution. This amendment gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuba with its military whenever it saw fit. Cuban patriots were extremely disappointed by what they saw as America's betrayal, and such resentments helped inspire the revolution in Cuba 50 years later. America's interest in their new insular possessions had more to do with trade than settlement or extracting resources. However, they sought Cuba and Puerto Rico, and in the Pacific, the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii, as outposts for trade to Latin America and Asia. In 1899, Secretary of State John Hay declared the, quote, open door policy. This policy demanded that European powers that had divided China into commercial spheres of influence allow equal trade access in that region to America as well. Western influence and presence in China soon led to the Boxer Rebellion in that nation, in which Christian Chinese and foreigners were targeted by Chinese nationalists, and American troops helped to quell the uprising. While many Cubans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans had welcomed American intervention as a means to gain independence from Spain, continued American control, direct and indirect, quickly alienated these patriots and others. After victory in the Philippines, Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the independence movement in the Philippines, established a provisional government with a constitution modeled on that of America. When McKinley decided to retain possession of the islands, the Filipinos rebelled. A second, longer, and far more bloody war ensued, lasting from 1899 to 1903, costing the lives of more than 100,000 Filipinos and 4,200 Americans. The war was hotly debated in the United States, where reports of atrocities against Filipino civilians, including burning villages, torture, and rape and executions, seemed to damage America's image as a liberator. McKinley's administration justified the war as an effort to, quote, uplift and civilize and Christianize the Filipinos. Most residents were already Catholics there. The American colonial government, led by William Howard Taft, quickly modernized the islands with railroads, schools, public health officials, and modern agriculture. But American policies in its new possessions tended to favor land-based local elites, whether native-born or American, and usually created persistent poverty for the majority of the people living there. American imperialism redefines freedom. It was not just in America that these kinds of justifications were made. All over the world, as the West came to dominate these other nations, you saw Western supremacy and ethnocentrism taking a hold. American rule in their territories came with American racial attitudes. In an 1899 poem, the British writer Rudyard Kipling asked the United States to take up, quote, the white man's burden of imperialism. American supporters of empire felt that white domination of non-white peoples represented the progress of civilization. But America's new empire sparked an intense debate about the interrelationship of democracy, race, and American citizenship. America's governmental system had no provision for permanent colonies, and the right of every people to self-government was a key principle in the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson's idea of America as an empire of liberty assumed that new territories would eventually be admitted as new states, and residents would be American citizens. Yet after the Spanish-American War, nationalism, democracy, and American freedom seemed aligned with ideas of Anglo-Saxon supremacy, much like it was in the majority of the Western world. Both Democratic and Republican leaders who wanted to retain the new possessions feared negative consequences of incorporating alien races into America. The Four-Acre Act of 1900 declared Puerto Rico as what was known as an insular territory, different from previous territories in the American West as it was settled. Puerto Rico's 1 million inhabitants were defined as citizens of Puerto Rico, not the United States, and they were denied a future path to statehood. Filipinos were given the same status. In a series of cases decided between 1901 and 1904, known as the Insular Cases, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution did not fully apply to overseas territories held by the United States. This sharply limited the extent of American freedom. Congress had to recognize the fundamental rights of these new peoples, but could otherwise govern them as it saw fit for an indefinite time. Hawaii became a traditional territory and was admitted as a state in 1959. The Philippines became independent in 1946, although Congress gave American citizenship to Puerto Ricans in 1917. Puerto Rico still has the status of a, quote, commonwealth, neither a state or a territory, which has its own government but lacks a voice in Congress and in presidential elections to this very day. America's racial attitudes had a global impact in the age of imperialism. Global concerns about immigration, race relations, and the white man's burden seemed to inspire solidarity among Anglo-Saxon nations. The burden was their duty, they thought. Chinese exclusion and segregation in the Jim Crow South influenced discriminatory laws in places like Canada, South Africa, and Australia. Other nations seemed to learn from Reconstruction's failure that multiracial democracy was impossible. Republic or empire? America's new empire caused intense debate and controversy. Opponents of empire formed the Anti-Imperialist League, which united people like writers and social reformers who wanted reforms at home, with businessmen who thought overseas empire was too expensive, and even racists who did not want non-whites brought within the United States borders. The League warned Americans that empire was incompatible with democracy and urged Americans to help Puerto Ricans and Filipinos gain their independence. In 1900, the Democrats once again nominated William Jennings Bryan to run against President McKinley, and the Democrats' platform opposed the Philippine War for military subjugating a foreign people, demanding, quote, liberty and self-government. The president of the Anti-Imperialist League declared that the nation's most pressing question was whether the nation would be a republic or an empire. Advocates of American empire embraced the language of freedom also. Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana argued that America sought abroad not material resources or national power, but rather desired only to, quote, bring freedom to other peoples, end quote. America practiced a benevolent imperialism, he argued, that would uplift backward cultures and spread liberty. America, Beveridge argued, only went abroad for trade, not to rule other nations. McKinley, benefiting from economic recovery and a swell of patriotism from winning the Spanish-American War, ultimately will beat Bryan in the 1900 election. As a result, at the start of the 20th century, America seemed ready to become a great power. Writers at home and abroad predicted that American influence would soon pervade the globe. In his book, The New Empire, Brooks Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams, predicted that America's economic might would make it outweigh any single empire, if not all empires combined. This did not happen until after World War II, but the characteristics that would constitute America's global strength were already present in 1900. The United States had already surpassed Britain, France, and Germany in industrial production. The merger movement of 1897 to 1904 left much of the economy controlled by corporations. Politics had also stabilized by that point, and the white North and South had reconciled. While hardened racial lines, segregation, Chinese exclusion, Indian reservations, all limited the boundaries of citizenship and freedom. Yet questions of central to 19th century debates over freedom, such as the relationship between economic and political liberty, the role of government in creating the social conditions for freedom, and the definition of citizenship and national identity, had not been answered definitively. Those questions would continue to be central to American life in the 20th century.